Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Granovetter. Welcome to another conversation with one of the most eminent academicians currently uh, working and writing in the field of economic sociology, Professor Mark Granovetter. This year, Caucus, the discussion forum, has explored a wide range of topics over the course of its activities, ranging from political sociology, economic sociology, other disciplines, philosophy, theology, ethics, even natural science, history, and so on. And it's indeed a pleasure to be hosting Professor Granovetter just a couple of days after we hosted Professor Martinelli. Uh, I'll just briefly introduce Professor Mark Granovetter to everybody who will be watching this interaction. So Professor Mark Granovetter, the Joan Butler Ford Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Stanford. He received his bachelor's from the University of Princeton and his doctorate from Harvard University. And Professor Granovetter's main interest is in the way people, social networks, and social institutions interact and shape one another. He has written extensively on this subject, including his two most widely cited articles, The Strength of Weak Ties, which was published in 1973, and Economic Action and Social Structure, The Problem of Embeddedness, published in 1985. The latter writing also happens to be in the syllabus of sociology students as part of their economic sociology paper. In recent years, his focus has been on the social foundations of the economy, and his book, Society and Economy, is to be published by Harvard University Press in 2 volumes. The first volume came out in 2017 and was titled Society and Economy, Framework and Principles. And the second volume, Society and Economy, Cases and Applications, will also extend his framework to further explore some of the other topics that Professor Granovetter has worked on in his career: personal relations in the economy, corruption, corporate governance, organizational form, and of course, the emergence of new industries such as the American electrical industry and the high-tech industry of Silicon Valley. So on that note, I would like to hand over the mic to Professor Granovetter so that he can briefly deliver his opening remarks, followed which we'll have more specific moderated questions. Thank you so much, Professor Granovetter, for accepting our invitation.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I don't actually have a mic because we are on Zoom, but you can say it's a virtual mic. So I'm going to tell you something about my history. I think that's what you asked me to start with. So I grew up in the state of New Jersey, and I went to university at Princeton University. And when I was starting at Princeton University, I had originally thought before I went to college that I would become a lawyer. But I think it was about 2 weeks into my freshman year that I abandoned that idea. And I started taking courses in history and political science, and especially history occupied my interest. And I became a history major in college. And I went through my 4 years in college at Princeton, which had at that time and still does a very outstanding history department. And I was very happy to be a history major. I did my bachelor's thesis, my honors thesis on the German youth movement in Germany from 1896 to 1933. And I took a great number of history courses. I took, during the time that I was an undergraduate, I took only actually one sociology course. And the reason I took that one sociology course was that by that time, when I was a senior in college, I knew that I was going to apply to graduate school in sociology. And I had the idea that if you're going to apply to graduate school in sociology, you should have at least one sociology course on your record. And so I took the course, although I actually wished I hadn't, because it wasn't a very good course, I'm sorry to say. I won't tell you who taught it, although I don't think he's probably any longer with us, but I still don't want to insult his memory. and I regretted because I missed a very good medieval history course that I could have taken. But anyway, I applied to graduate school in sociology. I actually only applied to two places. Um, let me stop and think whether there's anything else I want to tell you about my time in history. I think I should say that at some point when I was in college and when I was majoring in history, I thought to myself, I enjoy being in college so much. I'm sorry I can't be in college forever. And I thought, how can you do that? And I realized that there is a way to be in college forever, and that is to become a college professor. And so I decided that that was what I was going to do. But then I had a dilemma because I was a history major. I studied in particular modern European and American history was my specialty, although I took some other kinds of courses. If I was going to become a college professor, I had to choose a field, and I decided that I did not want to go on to graduate school in history. And the reason was that if you go to graduate school in history, then you have to specialize. You have to be a historian of modern America or modern Europe, France, Russia, some of those places. But you do have to specialize because people were professors of some very specific subject in history. And I didn't want to do that because even though I was very interested in questions like why was there a French Revolution or why was there a Russian Revolution, I was even more interested in the question of why are there revolutions? I was interested in general questions like that. And at some point during my undergraduate career, I realized that the field that studied questions like why are there revolutions was a field called sociology. And so I decided that that would have to be the subject that I went to graduate school in. And so I did. I applied when I was a senior in college. I applied to two programs. The sociology department at the University of California, Berkeley, which was then and is still an outstanding sociology department. And I also applied to Harvard University. And at that time, rather than being a sociology department, there was this unusual department called Department of Social Relations. The Department of Social Relations at Harvard had been originated by a sociologist named Talcott Parsons in the late 1940s. And Parsons thought that all the social sciences should join together. All the social sciences that talked about society should all be in the same department. And so he put together a department which had 5 branches. There was the department, there was social anthropology, there was social psychology, there was sociology, and then there were 2 psychological branches, which were child development and I think I said social psychology. What am I missing? Well, anyway, social anthropology, sociology, clinical psychology, social psychology, and sociology. So those are the 5. So it was a department like no other department in the United States and maybe the world that combined all those fields. And if you were a student, you had to be a student in one of those parts of the department. So I was a student in sociology, and my PhD is in sociology. But while you were a student, you had to take classes in all of those fields. So I had to take classes in anthropology and social psychology and clinical psychology and developmental psychology and social anthropology. And it was really something I enjoyed a great deal because I was always very interdisciplinary and my interests spanned all different subject areas. And so in that department, which was still in, it was still existed at the time that I was a grad student, which was from the years 1965 to 1970. I got my degree in sociology in 1970. And it turned out, so the students who were in that social relations department really enjoyed a great deal and got a lot out of taking courses in all those different subject areas. But the faculty in that department, in the different branches, were feeling very restless, and in each branch, they wanted to have their own department. And so around the time that I got my degree, which was 1970, the Department of Social Relations broke apart into its pieces. So the Department of Sociology was reconstituted. The social anthropologists joined with the physical anthropologists to form a department of anthropology. The various kinds of psychologists all joined together into a psychology department, and there was no more Department of Social Relations. So I was very lucky, really, to be one of the last students who had the benefit of being able to study all the different social science disciplines, as well as psychology, various kinds of psychology, all in the same program. So I think that having that education has given me a great deal of background and understanding of the social world and the human world in a way that I could never have gotten if I'd been in a pure sociology department. I think it's kind of sad that there do not exist any opportunities in the current period for students to have that kind of educational background. But anyway, that was my background. So I got my degree in sociology, and I went off I taught for 3 years at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And then I came back to Harvard for 5 more years to teach in sociology again. And then in 1977, I had to decide between going to Columbia University and a fairly new department called Stony Brook, the State University of New York at Stony Brook. And that department at Stony Brook seemed more exciting to me in that period. And so that's where I went. And I was at Stony Brook from 1977 to 1992. In 1992, I moved to the Department of Sociology at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, as you may well know. And then in 1995, I moved to Stanford University, and I have been at Stanford University since 1995. And in fact, on January 7th, I formally retired from Stanford. So I am now Professor Emeritus from Stanford University. And retirement gives you more time to focus on your writing. You don't have to worry about whether you have prepared the appropriate lecture for your class the next day. Instead, you just can do your writing and read more books. And so for me, that's a great pleasure. And so for me, retirement is just the next stage in my academic career. So that's a kind of short history of my academic life. I guess I should say a little bit about how I got interested in the kinds of things that I am interested in. So when I got to graduate school at Harvard, one of the professors that I became aware of was a professor named Harrison White. Harrison White was a professor of sociology, but he also had a PhD in theoretical physics, as well as his PhD in sociology. And so he had a very interesting way of thinking about the social world. And he was particularly interested in social networks, because social networks looked to him like the uh, some of the structures in some of the physical structures that he had studied when he was studying physics. He was particularly interested, for example, in crystal lattices. And crystal lattices, if you know anything about crystal lattices, you can think of them as a kind of particular kind of network structure. And so he was already thinking in network terms. And so when he moved over to sociology, and and what he said actually about why he left theoretical physics and moved over to sociology is that he decided he wanted to do something, he wanted to study something that was really difficult, not like theoretical physics, which he thought was rather easy. So he was, at the time that I arrived at Harvard as a graduate student, he was a fairly new professor, and he was teaching students about social networks. And there was a collection of students that organized around Harrison White and took him as our mentor. And we were very excited about his ideas about social networks. Uh, as a student of history, I already had some ideas about social networks, but I didn't know that the concept had a name. I just knew it was very interesting to think about how people were connected to one another and how that affected historical developments. So when I got to Harvard and met Harrison White, I realized that there actually was a field called social networks, and it was the field that I was particularly interested in. And so I became very interested in social networks. And because of my interest in social networks, I decided to write my doctoral dissertation on a subject that would show the importance of social networks. And I tried to think what that subject would be. And I narrowed it down to two possibilities. One was that I would study how people found their spouses, how husbands found their wives, and vice versa, because I think it was well known at that time that you found your spouses through social networks. So that was a subject that would show how important social networks are. And by the way, this is an interesting fact. At that time, um, people found their husbands or wives through their networks. They married friends of friends or relatives of friends or friends of relatives and so on. It turns out that, at least in the United States, and it may be different in India, it's no longer the case that people find spouses that way. How do you think people find their spouses now? I throw that open to you for the moment. Well, I don't know if it's true in India. And I know that there may still be some arranged marriages in India, but in the United States and in Europe, people now find their spouses online. They find them through Match.com or OkCupid, or I assume that there are equivalents in India for people to find their spouses, and it's quite remarkable that that has changed. But anyway, at the time that I did my dissertation, that was how people found their spouses. And the other subject that I thought might be interesting was to study how people find jobs. Because I thought there was some information, there had been some studies done by economists that showed that people found their jobs through social networks. So I decided finally to do my dissertation on how people find jobs. And that really determined a lot about what followed for me, because doing my dissertation on how people find jobs, and it turned out that indeed people do find their jobs through social networks. They did in 1970, and it turns out that, at least in the United States, they still find their jobs through social networks, even though many, many things have changed, and we now have LinkedIn, and we have AI, and we have all kinds of other ways you might think people might find jobs. But it turns out they still find jobs through social networks. That has not changed very much, unlike how people find their spouses. So doing my dissertation on how people find jobs got me interested in the economy. And once I got interested in the economy, and by the way, as you may well know, I did publish a book on how people find jobs, which is called Getting a Job, which appeared, the first edition appeared in 1974, and the second edition appeared in 1995 from the University of Chicago Press. And I believe you can get a copy of that book online if you're interested in taking a look at that, or maybe you already know about it. So I got interested in the economy, and the more I got interested in the economy, the more I thought that there is a more interesting way of looking at the economy than the way economists look at it. And there ought to be a sociological approach to the economy. And so I started thinking about what that would look like. And the more I thought about it, the more interested I got. And finally, and actually I spent a year in 1981, 1982, as a visiting scholar at a place called the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which is not part of the university, by the way. It's independent. It's the place where Albert Einstein resided for many years. And in that year, I became acquainted with the economist Albert Hirschman and the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, and we talked a great deal about this question of what the economy looked like and how you could analyze it. And that was one of the influences on me as I put together a paper about how you might think about the economy in social terms. And that paper became the 1985 paper that I think you know about, which is called Economic Action and Social Structure, the Problem of Embeddedness. And I don't know if this is interesting or not, but the journal was the American Journal of Sociology. And I'm sure you know, when you send a paper to a journal, they send it out to people to read it and tell them whether they should publish it or not. And one of the people they sent the paper out to must have been an economist, and the economist said, "Oh, this is very confusing to me. I'm not sure what he's talking about." The first draft of the paper was called Economic Action and Social Structure, a Theory of Embeddedness. And this person, who was probably an economist, said, well, this is not a theory. You can't call it a theory. And so that's when the subtitle became The Problem of Embeddedness. So I made that small concession, and the journal published the paper. So as they say, the rest is history. So since that time, I have been working on quite a few different subjects. And as you mentioned, in 2017, I published the first volume of what will be 2 volumes of a book called Society and Economy, which is quite a general approach to the study of the economy, where social networks are important, but they're not the main theme. They're only one of a number of different themes. In that 2017 book, I have chapters on norms and power and institutions and trust. And so I think it's very interesting. It was very interesting for me to think about the larger subject of what the economy looked like from a sociological point of view. And I thought that really subsumed the economic point of view. I thought the sociological point of view and the economic point of view really needed to be put together into a single point of view. And that's what I was trying to do in Society and Economy. I wasn't trying to, there is something called economic imperialism. There were some economists like Gary Becker who thought that economics should just take over all the other social sciences. I don't think sociology should take over all the social sciences. I think that all the social sciences should work together. And so my 2017 book is an attempt in that direction to try to show what a unified social science would look like. Okay, so that's my brief, although maybe not brief enough, history of my academic journey. So I am open for any kinds of questions or discussions that you would like to engage in.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Granovetter. You discussed pretty much all the points that Shubha and I had in mind. And to the audience, I'd encourage them to send their question in the chat box, or they could wait until, say, a bit towards the end, where they could raise their hands and ask their questions verbally. But Professor Granovetter, by listening to you reminisce about your journey so far, uh, as a history student, the first issue that I noticed was about your switch from studying history to studying sociology, and the fact that you mentioned that a lot of the deeper problems of generalization that you were interested in were covered in sociology rather than history. Um, Today, as a student of history in, say, 2025, if I look at we have a course in India, in Indian universities called The Rise of the Modern West, and it discusses issues such as the emergence of capitalism and industrialization and so on. A lot of the works therein are effectively works of macro-historical sociology. For instance, Perry Anderson, both the volumes of Perry Anderson, which I think were published in the 1970s. That would have been, I think, about a decade after you embarked on undergraduate education. Um, to what extent do you think historical writing has evolved over the time, in the sense that history writing does involve a lot of social theory uh, in our times? And what are your thoughts on the issue of generalization? Because somewhere history as an empirical subject, or the empirical component of history, it also acts as a shackle towards, say, some of the deeper generalizations which scholars attempt to make in the social sciences. So what are your reflections on these tensions within history and, say, other social sciences?
I think that Perry Anderson is a remarkable scholar, but I think there are not many Perry Andersons. I think that in the field of history, someone like Perry Anderson is unusual, still unusual. And I think that as I understand what is going on in history, and actually um, I have a dissertation student whom I'm advising who's in the history department, so I'm keeping up with what historians do. And in fact, I read a lot of history in as part of the research that I'm doing for the book I'm writing. I think that historians have mostly, although they are more aware of social science and sociology than they used to be, but I think they're still doing fairly traditional history, studying a particular time and place, and studying it in great detail. And I think that's actually very valuable. Um, so for example, there is a remarkable book called The Familiarity of Strangers, which is written by an Italian historian named Francesca Trivellato, which is about an Italian city called Livorno, which is on the west coast of Italy. It's a very important trading city. And Trivellato studies traders in that city in the 16th century and the 17th and 18th centuries, and shows how they're able to trade with people all over the world, even though they didn't travel all over the world themselves. And so it's very interesting. She does a very deep dive into archives and memoirs and ledgers and materials from one of the trading families. And she shows that these traders in Livorno in that period traded with people all over the world, even though they had not met them in person. They maintained enormous correspondence with them, a very intricate and complicated correspondence, which they carried out with one another, and it was very stylized. There were actually, in this period, etiquette manuals telling you how to compose letters to people that you're trading with. So these people on the west coast of Italy traded with with traders in India, for example, and in Portuguese Goa, and other parts of India, and they traded high value jewels, even though it was very risky, you might say, even though they'd never actually met one another in person, but they'd exchanged all these letters. So historians like Trivelato do this enormously detailed deep dive into the archives, and they find fascinating details about how things worked in a very specific time and place. And I think this is still what historians do the best. And I think it's enormously valuable. For me, I love reading historical accounts like that because I can read those accounts and then I can think about what it means for a broader sociological argument. So I think that even though there are a few scholars, have been a few scholars like Perry Anderson, and there are a few others who take a very broad view and look across the centuries and so on, most historians still are focused on particular times and places. And I think that's fine. I think it's very valuable work. And I am a big reader of those kinds of accounts. I think they're enormously valuable, and I think I'm glad that historians have not all become sociologists, because then we would lose what historians do, and what they do is very valuable. So I think that it's not a bad thing, actually, that we have different disciplines who have different points of view and do different kinds of work. I think it's a great resource for those of us who are willing to read outside our own discipline.
As a follow-up to that question, we spoke with Professor Joel Mokir of Northwestern University, I think in December 2024. And even that conversation was to some degree centered around institutions and Polanyi and so on, the formalist substantivist debate, with an added historical dimension of the primitivist and modernist dichotomy as well, and so on. And an issue which Professor Mokir raised, which I've been thinking about for I think nearly half a year now, has been about the ideological divides which exist between disciplines. So, for instance, Professor Mokir spoke about the fact that most economists who write about economic history aren't, say, as emotive or as vociferous a critic of, say, the developments that took place over the 18th and 19th century with the enclosure movement and so on, as opposed to, say, historians who talk about the rise of capitalism. I think at least one issue which you highlighted with economists as well, and their conceited attempts at being a universalist discipline which takes over all the social sciences, is ideologically driven as well. Do you think that in current academic writing, such ideological divides, how important do you think such ideological divides are between, say, and do you agree that such a divide exists at all? Or is it more about, say, deeper methodological issues between disciplines rather than stemming from ideological divisions?
So I think that Joel Mokir is, again, one of the few historians who take such a broad view of things, as the way Perry Anderson did, although, of course, in a very different set of issues. I don't think that what divides disciplines is ideology. It may be the case that sociologists and economists and historians, there may be some ideological differences, but I don't think that's what determines the differences in the kind of work we do. I think it's a different conception of what it is that we should be studying. So I think that economists have a fairly well-defined, I could say narrow, but I'm trying to be kind here. So I think they have a very strongly, narrowly defined idea of what it is they're studying, which is to find out what the economic um, what economic sense it makes for people to do things the way they do them. And so they have a whole collection of tools, which are predominantly these days mathematical tools. And by the way, that's fairly recent. You could say that economists have been this mathematical. You may say that it began in the late 19th century, but I think that it's only from the 1950s on that economics has been as mathematical as it is now. And I think that something has been lost in all that mathematics. And I think that some economists are starting to see that although mathematics is a valuable language, and in fact, there are many sociologists who use mathematics, but not as many as, if you are a young economist and you want to publish papers in a journal, then there had better be some equations in your paper, because otherwise no one's going to take it seriously. And while some sociologists publish papers that have equations in them, it's not necessary. And you may have noticed that in my papers, in the strength of weak ties, in the embeddedness paper, in my other papers, there are no equations. And that's not because it would have been impossible to have them. So, for example, in my paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, which you may know, it would have been possible to develop those arguments mathematically. But I thought that if I did that, and I considered doing it that way, but I thought that if I did it that way, I would lose a large part of my audience, and many people who read the paper would not see the larger arguments that I was trying to make. So I kept that paper as non-mathematical as I could. There are some hints at the mathematics. There is in that paper a bit of graph theory, but just enough to make my arguments. So I think what a sociologist would say about how much mathematics they need in their paper is no more than is absolutely necessary to make your argument. Because if there's more than is absolutely necessary, then it's going to distract people from what it is you're saying. Whereas if you're a young economist, you put in as many equations as you can so that you can have professional validation. If you want to advance your career, you have to, among other things, it's not the only thing you have to be, but certainly it's a necessary condition to advance your career, to show that you are mathematically talented and adept and can write all the appropriate equations. So that's not exactly an ideology, but it's a way of thinking about what it is you're doing. And I think that in this period, in this early 21st century period, this idea that economists have that they can only express themselves mathematically is distracting some of them from thinking carefully about the subject matter that they're studying. So I think that sociologists have what economists call a comparative advantage, in that we understand that mathematics is useful tool, but it's not the only tool we have. So there are some differences like that. Historians, of course, don't use any mathematics. There was a period, actually, when historians were getting mathematical, but that period only lasted about 20 years. And now they're back to doing almost entirely qualitative work. And I'm happy to see them doing that, because some of that qualitative work, like the book by Trivelato that I mentioned, is very valuable. It's a tremendously valuable resource, because if I wanted to know how traders on the west coast of Italy in the 17th century connected to other traders, it would take me years and years to find that out. And here's Trivelato's done it all for me. So it saves me, and all I have to do is read her book. Now, her book is 877 pages, so it takes a while, but it doesn't take as long as it would take if I did the research myself. So I think the division of labor and the different ways of thinking about the world that different disciplines have is actually kind of useful. And I don't think it would be such a good idea for all the different academic fields to merge and think about the world in the same way.
We are getting closer to the first set of questions that we had, which pertain specifically to your papers. But I think one question that I'd still like to ask before we delve specifically into that, since you reiterated the fact that your conviction that these different disciplines retain value even when they have different approaches. Professor Mokir recently uh, has spent, I think, at least a couple of decades being the series editor of the Princeton Economic History of the Western World, which sort of tries to give, again, a macro view of economic development in the West, as it is so called, from antiquity and so on. And one thing that I noticed in all the works, and which has been reinforced by the recent 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics, which was won by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, is the fact that new institutional economics has once again become, especially with AJR and the cross-country regressions and the mathematics that they have introduced in the way they talk about institutions, is gaining ascendancy, and it's gaining dominance. Too much so, to the extent that even the Roman economy, which for a very long time, and even in Indian universities now, is studied through the works of Moses Finlay, who wrote the Ancient Economy, and he brought in the conceptions of Polanyi. But even the Roman economy is seen through the lens of the market economy and through a modernist and formalist lens. How do you view this recent trend in economics? And we could sort of perhaps use this as a segue to delve into your paper, Economic Action and Social Structure, in some more depth. But what are your reflections on these recent trajectories in institutionalist economics, and especially given how they are gaining prominence nowadays?
Well, I think that Joel Mokyr is much more sophisticated than the people who do the so-called new institutional economics. There, I think of particularly Oliver Williamson. And I don't think that the new institutional economics is as important or dominant in the field as it might have been when it began in the 1980s. I think that people have moved beyond that. And I think that the new institutional economics, at least as Oliver Williamson has proposed it, is extremely limited. And I do talk about this, as I'm sure you know, in my paper, my 1985 paper on embeddedness, where I use Williamson as a kind of whipping boy, I suppose you could say. I think that's how he felt about it. Because the problem is that he thinks that hierarchy is the solution for any problems that people have that they cannot work out in their interaction with one another. Then they have to be, if you have people who are trying to make contracts with one another and the contracts get too complicated, then you just have to incorporate that into a firm that has a hierarchy, and then the hierarchy will solve all the problems by something that Williamson called fiat. Well, it's very interesting that he uses the word fiat, because fiat, well, I don't know if any of you read the Christian Bible, and if you read the Christian Bible, you probably don't read it in Latin, although people used to read it in Latin. But if you did read it in Latin, you would find that in the book of Genesis, very early in the book, when God is creating the earth, the first thing that God says is, fiat lux, and that is Latin for let there be light. So fiat is something that means let something happen. And so I think that it's interesting that Williamson uses the word fiat to describe the ability of hierarchies and organizations to give orders, because it means that he thinks that the people who are at the top of an organizational hierarchy are like gods, that they have godly power. When they say that something will happen, then it just automatically happens. And of course, the world is not like that. And I sometimes wonder what kind of organizations Williamson had experience with, because there are not any real organizations where people who are high up in the organization have godly power. It turns out that it's difficult to give orders, and that much more complicated things happen in organizations. And there are many situations where people who have complicated contracts to carry out with one another, rather than uh, internalize all that within hierarchies, they rely on the fact that they actually have personal knowledge of one another. They are personally acquainted with one another, and they solve problems by sitting down together and using their personal relationship to solve those problems. And they come to agreement that is not necessarily only reflected in a legal contract. So a legal contract is something that is sometimes important and useful and sometimes not. Many times the fact that people in business know each other or are part of the same religious group or social group. They're, for example, um, in the case of of India, the business houses are often, I think, for example, of the Tata group and other groups that are usually one particular religion or one particular social background. And so a great deal of what happens within those groups, for example, and this is true all over the world, and I've written a lot actually about business groups. I don't know if you've seen those papers, but they're very interesting to me, is that people rely on the fact that they know other people in the group or in a collection of firms, and they rely on that personal relationship. Maybe they come from the same background, maybe they are in the same religious group, they're Parsis, or they're some other group, and and this is how a great many agreements are people come to a great many agreements this way, rather than rely on an organizational hierarchy to give orders. That's not the way most problems are solved.
Right. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer, Professor. And to get a bit more into your papers, as Pushkar already mentioned, in your 1985 paper, which has already been mentioned so many times, you propose embeddedness as a middle ground between the under-socialized and over-socialized views of economic actors. Could you elaborate on how embeddedness differs from these two extremes, for example, by referring to your observation that economic action is embedded in structures of social relations and that actors are neither isolated atoms nor mere automations of social script? And how do you think this insight has reshaped the broader understanding of forms and markets in economic sociology?
So you're asking how embeddedness differs from what?
Uh, Differs from the two extremes of under socialized and over socialized views of economic actors, and how it has reshaped our insights into the understanding of forms and markets overall in economic sociology.
Right. So I think that the argument that I make in that paper is that people are, you might think that people have everything that they're going to do in the economy is just already in their heads. They've internalized it from some set of principles, and they just go through life, go through their life in the economy, doing what they have learned to do, what they have been trained to do, what ideology they have. in ways that don't require them to interact with other people. So that would be the under-socialized view, and the that would be that would be the over-socialized view. And the under-socialized view would be that people are just all utility maximizers, and all they're thinking about when they deal with other people is how they can achieve their own goals, regardless of whether other people's goals have anything to do with it, and without necessarily talking to other people. So that's the under-socialized view, and a lot of economics looks like that everybody is just pursuing his own particular goals, and so the middle ground is what we actually see in real life, which is that people exist in social networks, and they deal all the time in the economy with people that they know that they have some kind of relationship with, and they use that relationship as a way of regulating their activities in the economy, and that means also that they are necessarily trying to create an economic outcome that is not just maximizing their own benefits, but that somehow also takes account of what the other parties need. Because if you know the other people and you have some kind of social relationship with those other people, then you have to have some idea and some feeling that they need to benefit also. So I think that in the real economy, people are somewhat selfish, of course, because they're trying to achieve some goals, but they also realize that they are dealing with other actors who have their own goals, and that there has to be some kind of accommodation reached between those different parties. So that's how the embeddedness argument differs from the under-socialized argument, where people are just all out for themselves, and because in that situation, it's like what the great philosopher Thomas Hobbes described as the war of all against all, or the war of each man against every man. And if you've read Leviathan, then you know that Hobbes said that when that happens, when everyone is trying to maximize their own benefit and nothing else, that what you get is the war of all against all. And that's what he thought what he called the state of nature was like. And in the state of nature, he said, and this is a very famous 5 adjectives in political philosophy: the life of man in the state of nature is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And in particular, he was not talking about the economy. He was talking about politics and why we have political leaders. And his argument was you had to have political leaders. You had to have a king or an emperor to prevent people from everyone killing everybody else, or at least being at war with everyone else. And it seems that Williamson, who may or may not have read Hobbes, has the same idea about the world, that when people are trying to make contracts with one another, it's impossible for them to do it if it's complicated. Therefore, they have to give all their power over to some hierarchy in an organization, which will solve all the problems by fiat. Of course, that's not how the real world works. In the real world, people deal with other people with whom they have social relationships, and those social relationships in the economy make a huge difference in what happens. And we have now quite a few very useful empirical studies that show exactly how that works.
Thank you so much for that answer, sir. And back in your introductory note, there were certain things that popped to my mind, especially when you asked about all how people get married and also about relationships and all. But then you also pivoted about contemporary development. So in today's digital economy, especially with platform companies mediating ostensibly between impersonal transactions, how do you see embeddedness at work today? Contemporary studies of gig economy suggest a paradox. Platform workers often lack institutional protections, yet remain enmeshed in personal networks of trust. For example, recent research notes that platform labor can be normatively disembedded, deprived of regulations, while simultaneously embedded within interpersonal networks of trust, enabling work despite the low trust environment. How does your embeddedness framework help us interpret this phenomenon of digital workers being formally disembedded but socially embedded?
Workers being formally disembedded from from what?
From the macro level employment system, because the gig economy doesn't really give you a proper system of employment. There are more platform workers, quote unquote. So how would you interpret that, if I may ask?
Well, I, it's a complicated question. I think that in small organizations, people are usually working with employers that they actually know, that they know from past employment, or they know from their social background, or they know from some other way. And that personal knowledge really replaces any kind of contractual agreements that people have about how they're supposed to work and what they're supposed to do. In larger organizations, it isn't very likely that the workers know the people who are at the top of the hierarchy, but they do form personal relationships with their immediate superiors. And those personal relationships make a great deal of difference. And we do have some studies that show how that works, how managers, for example, have relationships with the people at one level below them, and how those relationships are complicated, but really the way those relationships work out replaces what it says in the formal rules of the organization. So there is, for example, a remarkable book that was written a long time ago in the 1950s by a sociologist named Melville Dalton called Men Who Manage. And he studies an organization. It's actually a chemical plant. And he studies the hierarchy and how the hierarchy works and how people actually, he shows the formal organization chart, and then he shows how people actually relate to people in the hierarchy. And in fact, he shows that he has some very interesting diagrams. He shows the formal organization chart as it is in principle, and then he shows the real organization chart, which shows which people actually interact with which other people and which people actually have authority over other people. And it's quite different. It's what he calls the informal organization chart. It's quite different because of the kind of social relationships and historical relationships that people have with one another. They really replace the formal structure. And I think there are a lot of organizations where the informal relationships and the history that people have with one another replaces what in theory is supposed to happen. Someone like Williamson only knows the theory. And the reason, I think, is that Williamson never studied an actual organization. He only has an idea of how organizations are supposed to work. It's a theoretical ideal which is not met in any real organization. And if he'd studied real organizations, he might have realized that. But it was easier for him to sit in his office and invent what he thought was supposed to happen. And I think sociologists mostly have more sense than to do that. They know they need to actually get out there and find out what is going on in the actual organization. Some economists have started to do that. There are some who only spin models and equations, but there are more and more economists who get out into the world and study what happens in real organizations. And I think that they're not the same as sociologists, but there's some kind of convergence between some sociologists and some economists. There are some sociologists whose theories are very abstract, And there are some economists whose theories are very abstract. And those very abstract theorists from different disciplines have trouble talking to one another. But the people who, in both disciplines, in sociology and economics, who study actual organizations, they can have very good conversations. And I gave a talk, for example, recently I gave a talk at an economics conference on social networks. And it was very interesting to talk to those people because we really, in many ways, spoke the same language, even though they're economists and I'm a sociologist. I felt like we could really communicate with one another, and it was very useful. So there are some of those kinds of interactions that take place.
Thank you, sir, for that answer, and on a very contemporary topic as well. So, we've already mentioned about networks and trust. So, your work emphasizes the economic transactions are sustained by social networks and trust rather than just purely formal market mechanisms. Now, in taking a crisis situation in the context of financial crisis, when institutional trust breakdowns, how do you interpret the role of embeddedness? What insights does it offer? Like, for example, if interbank lending froze during the 2008 crisis, was this due to a failure of local trust networks? And how could the idea in like would more cross-cutting weak ties or reputational networks have mitigated this panic?
Well, there are there are some who think that the 2008 crisis would not have happened 100 years earlier, because 100 years earlier, the bankers and the industrialists and all those people, they all knew each other, and there was a guy named J.P. Morgan who was very powerful and who knew all the other bankers and got on. And apparently, what actually happened in that crisis was that he got on the telephone and he talked to the other bankers and he said, you can't do this. We have to all get together and make sure the economy doesn't fail. And because they were such a close-knit network and because he was such a powerful man, the crisis was much less than it might have been. In 2008, that network was much less connected, and there weren't really such powerful figures as J.P. Morgan. And there are theorists, for example, there's a sociologist named Mark Mizrachi, who's written a very interesting book, which is called, I'm sorry, I'm looking on my bookshelf for the title. Let's see here. Yes. So Mark Mizrachi has a book, I think it's 2013, called The Fracturing of the American Corporate Elite. And his argument is that if you look at the network of the top people in American corporations in 2008 compared to 1908, it is not nearly as cohesive. It's much more fractured. And because it's fractured, which means that there are different groups of people connected over here or over here or over here, but not the whole structure is not connected. Because of that, it's much more difficult for people to get together and make decisions that will reduce the severity of the crisis. And so I think that the message, and I do talk about this in my chapter on power in my 2017 book, the message is that if you want to understand what happens in crises, what happens in different kinds of situations, you have to understand something about the networks of people who are powerful and how those networks relate to one another, how those people relate to one another, how much cohesion there is. Because if it's fractured, which is Mizrachi's argument, then it's very difficult for the whole collection of people to pull together and prevent the kinds of problems we had in 2008. So that's a very interesting argument, and it's one that is very difficult to implement because I think in some ways it's much more convenient to be an economist talking about this, because all you have to do is sit in your office and write equations, and then you can solve the problem. If you're a sociologist who wants to analyze this, you actually have to examine what the structure of social ties is among all these different hundreds of people who are in the American corporate elite. And that's much more complicated. And you may not be able to do it just by sitting in your office. You might actually have to get out and talk to people and find out what their relationships are. You might have to study who's on boards of directors. You might have to collect a great deal of empirical information. So I think in some ways, it's more difficult to be a sociologist of the economy than to be at least a traditional economist. Now, I think there are some economists who realize that you also have to get out and find out what's going on in the real world. So I think that they do it differently from the way sociologists would do it, but there's still some convergence there.
The fact that you mentioned that something like the 2008 financial crisis would probably not have taken place 100 years ago is a springboard that I'd like to use to discuss another issue which you alluded to over the course of your opening remarks, and that is the experience of India. And those of us in India and in, say, context of the global South have often, say, exhibited trajectories of development and modernization that are different from that of the global North, as it is so called. I have a couple of questions which sort of flow into each other. And I would like to start off with a sentence that you wrote in your 1985 paper with the word modernization in quotation marks, because modernization is a term that has fascinated all of us, especially in post-colonial contexts wherein we harbored aspirations of modernizing. And you wrote in that paper that the level of embeddedness of economic behavior is lower in non-market societies than is claimed by substantivists and development theorists, and it has changed less with modernization than they believe. But you argue also that this level has always been and continues to be more substantial than is allowed for formalists, allowed for by formalists and economists. My query here pertains to this transition, rather than, say, the theory which we have discussed over the course of this conversation so far. How do you think modernization impacted the level of embeddedness? And how do you look back at Karl Polanyi's work in retrospect?
Well, of course, Polanyi argued that there was a very sharp break in the 19th century, and that there was embeddedness earlier, and that the Great Transformation, which is, of course, is the title of his important book, is one in which that level of embeddedness was greatly reduced, and people became completely subordinate to whatever economic situation they were in, without having the kind of social or ties to other actors in the economy that they had before. And I think that it's interesting to read that book and think about whether he's serious about what he's saying, because later in the book, when he talks about how people responded to this problem, he talks about and it's what he calls a double movement, that there was a movement on the part of society to reverse some of these trends. And so I think it shows that he knew that it wasn't, that he was exaggerating, that the level of embeddedness in modern society after the Great Transformation was not really so much less than it had been before, because otherwise, how would people have been able to get together and try to change and reverse some of the trends that they had? So my argument is that the level of embeddedness, and it isn't entirely clear what we mean by that. One of the things that strikes me about this term embeddedness, which I used in my 1985 paper, is that I did not mean for anyone to go out and try to find out how much embeddedness there is by giving a number, by putting a number on it. I never thought of it as that kind of concept. There are people who've gone out and tried to say, well, in this period, embeddedness was 73, and in this period, it was 112. To me, that doesn't mean anything. I think that it's more of a qualitative question. How important was it in a given period that people have social relationships with one another as compared to their relationships in another period? And I think that my argument would be that social relationships in the economy have always mattered, and they continue to matter, but that doesn't mean that they matter in exactly the same way. I think social relationships in the modern economy are different from the way they were in, let's say, the ancient economy or the medieval economy. I think they're important in every economy, but they're important in different ways. So, for example, in the modern economy, if you think about what are called OEMs, which is companies that actually assemble a product, original equipment manufacturers. If you think about them and their suppliers who supply them with the parts that they use to put together, the relationships between those companies, there are formal and there are contracts, and it's pretty complicated. But it's also the case that a critical part of what goes on, as a number of studies have shown, is that there are people in the suppliers, in the supplier firms, like the first tier suppliers, as sometimes called. When you have an OEM, they put together an automobile or a piece of farm equipment and so on, and then they have first tier suppliers who supply the major parts, and then there are second tier suppliers and they supply the first tier suppliers, and so on down the line. So in manufacturing, there are these distinctions. But I think what is interesting is that the relationships between some of the executives and managers in the first tier suppliers to their counterparts in the original equipment manufacturers are very important. And the reason they're very important is because when you have those kinds of relationships between firms, then there are always going to be problems that need to be solved. So how do those problems get solved? Well, if you are Oliver Williamson, you say, well, the way you solve those problems is you look at the contract, and the contract tells you how to solve those problems. And the hierarchy in each firm will tell you how to solve the problem. But in fact, that's not how problems are solved. In fact, what happens is that some of the executives in the supplier firm and some of the executives in the OEM firm have personal relationships with one another. They know each other. And the reason that that's important is that when there are problems, they don't call each other on the phone and say, here's what the contract says. Instead, they get together, and they may even meet together, and they say, well, we have this problem now. How are we going to fix it? And they get together and they think about how to fix it, and they don't refer to the contract. Because they know each other and they trust each other, they figure out a way to solve the problem. And so that's very different than what happens in, let's say, a group of hunters and gatherers where everybody knows everybody else, or ancient Rome, where different people know different people in different settings, and they have different, it turns out in ancient Rome, it's an interesting fact that most of the businesses in ancient Rome were run by slaves or former slaves. It's really surprising. It's probably the only slave economy. And one of the things about the ancient world is that everywhere in the ancient world, it was assumed that if you had a military conquest, you would take all the males that you had conquered, and you would bring them back to your own place, and they would be slaves. And so there were enormous numbers of slaves in ancient Rome. And one of the things they did was they ran all the firms, all the businesses. And the reason they did that, there's a couple of things to say about that. And I'll come back to your larger questions soon. I know I'm digressing a little bit, but this is pretty interesting, I think. The reason they did it that way was there are a couple of reasons. One is that ordinary citizens in ancient Rome did not want to do business. They didn't want to run businesses. They thought that that was not a valuable or prestigious thing to do. And so they weren't running the businesses. And the people, the wealthy people who had slaves didn't want to run the business themselves because that's hard work, and they didn't want to do that particular kind of hard work. So they needed people they could trust, and they could trust their slaves and also even their emancipated slaves who stayed in their household and ran their businesses. And so that's a very peculiar and unusual kind of personal relationship. So in every stage of the economy and the history of the world, there have been personal relationships that were important, but they were important in different ways in different settings. And I think one of the things that we have to do is to try to figure out how these relationships are different in different settings. And I think it's clear that they are important everywhere, but they're important in different ways, which is one of the things we have to figure out. So let me see, we have, okay, at some point, I'm not sure when you want to do this. I'm sure you both have more questions, and we could probably do this for several days, but I don't think anybody has the time or the energy for that. But there are starting to be questions in the chat, so at some point, we should probably address those. But meanwhile, Pushkar and Shub, you should continue.
So we will take on questions from the chat box. I think I have only a question or two. I think one question to be more specific, and then we could. Shub, in the meanwhile, just check the question in the chat box to see if there are any redundancies. And I think the follow-up that I had to the earlier question that I asked, and the reason I focused specifically on the transition and the bit about modernization, is the fact that in Indian academia, from about the 70s or 80s, one line of dispute between scholars of all inclinations and an emerging collective, which was called the Subaltern Studies Collective, was regarding the extent to which one can universalize analytical frameworks and categories while trying to understand what modernization means and the trajectory on which modernization takes you. And I would say, in response to, say, some of those who asserted that different societies and different cultures are irreconcilably different, just because they happen to deviate from, say, a homogeneous understanding of what the economy should be like and what society should be like, I would say to them that, well, if one takes the approach of embeddedness and its qualitative differences, at least methodologically speaking, we have a coherent concept through which we can understand all these different societies without having to be nihilistic in rejecting all sorts of categories. But nevertheless, in countries like India, and this is, I think, the nature of marriages and relations was a topic that you spoke about in your opening address, that it's shifted mostly to online platforms nowadays in the United States. In India, most marriages, and last time I checked the statistics, it was about, say, 97 or 98% of all marriages were arranged marriages. And
even now.
Even now, it's very recent data from just a few years ago, and most of them are on the basis of caste endogamy. And there are, of course, and it's not just about caste, it's it becomes as specific as the subcaste. So
Is
some
that?
subcaste of
Oh, yes,
Brahmins.
absolutely. So my guide to this is a remarkable book, which you may know, by an anthropologist named Adrian Mayer, called Caste and Kinship in Central India. Of course, it takes place in the 1950s, but it sounds to me as if and he's very interested in the caste and subcaste differences. And it sounds to me like some of the patterns that you were talking about are not that different. And he's talking about villages. Now, I think some argue that this is much less likely in big cities where caste is not quite as important, but maybe you don't agree with that. Maybe that's not the case.
I was reading a work about the early 20th century labor history by Dipesh Chakrabarti, and he wrote on the labor history of Bengal and early 20th century. And even the mobilization of labor was primarily on caste lines. So you had jobbers who would bring people of their caste kins from the village on the basis of caste. And I'd say that even today, based on, say, my limited interaction, of course, because colleges are elite settings in many ways, that these patterns subsist. So you bring about, say, you employ someone based on such kind of networks. The question that I posed to Professor Sanjeev Goyal, because we also hosted Professor Sanjeev Goyal, was why is it that caste endogamy persists? Why is it so pervasive a part of India? And in his presentation, there was a section on informal networks. And he went on to say that informal networks persist in parts of the global south with a surprising degree of resilience as opposed to, say, Western Europe and Northern America and so on. And I was wondering if what really explains this degree of resilience in informal networks in large parts of the global south? Caste, of course, is a subset of informal networks, but what explains its resilience?
So, and it's interesting to me that India is called part of the global south, given the fact that it's north of the equator. But never mind. That's just a terminological thing. So, are you asking about India, or are you asking about the rest of the global south?
I cited India because of the fact that I remember the data about caste endogamy and I could cite it to you without looking it up. But it is indeed a broader question about India, but also I think parts of Eastern Africa, Mauritania, and other parts which still exhibit structures of society which are extremely similar to caste endogamy. In fact, at least based on my reading of labor history, the argument has been that capitalists have consciously exploited caste and gender divisions. And some scholars argue that they have exploited it on economistic grounds of economic rationality. But
So who is
nevertheless,
so who is doing the exploiting?
capitalists, but primarily capitalists of a certain background.
Okay. Um, so is Hindu college, is it coeducational or is it all males?
It is co-educational.
It is coeducational. And so don't males and females within Hindu college have some kinds of relationships with one another?
They do, but at least I'd still say that a lot of it is structured on either lines of class and caste and region and so on, even today, even nowadays.
Even today and even within the college.
I'd say so, yes. I know people may
Isn't
not
that
agree with this, but it's been
isn't that interesting? Yes. I mean, that's not the case in American colleges, which are much more, well, we don't have distinctions like caste. And of course, scholars like, for example, Dumont argue that caste is unique, that there's no other country that has an institution which looks like caste. And I think that he makes actually a fairly persuasive argument to that effect. So what kind of endogamy are you talking about outside of India, in other countries, in the so-called global South?
I was referring to a few case studies that I had read about Eastern Africa, but it was more on the lines of, say, still a largely rural society which is untouched by, say, modernization, quote unquote, as we refer to it. But so I'd still say that there are more peripheral cases because they haven't yet seen the sort of industrialization that India has. But the surprising thing about India would be the fact that caste relations are reproduced in many cases, even in the industrial sector, by a segmented labor market, and the fact that these distinctions do sort of still linger on rather than being surmounted or transcended.
Which distinctions you're talking about East Africa?
The I don't remember the exact case studies that I had read, but the ones that I was referring to are mostly in the rural setting, whereas the example of India that I gave is the fact that caste somehow lingers on even in contexts where otherwise one would have expected it to sublime.
So are
And it
you
was
talking about Indians in East Africa?
no. I'm not talking about Indians.
No,
I'm talking
you're
about
not talking about Indians.
tribes. Yeah,
You're talking about
tribes in
natives,
Spanish contexts. Yes.
right? So then there are probably tribal distinctions that linger on in that context, in the East African context. So that's interesting to think about that. I think that in the U.S., um, for example, there is more and more marriage across ethnic lines and across class lines than there was, let's say, 100 years ago. And so that trend has not, and I think part of it is that students go to college far from home, where their influence of their family is very much reduced. And it's also now the fact that people are finding people online to go out with, and that's more likely to be people who are not from the same social background. So there are settings where the kind of endogamy that you're talking about is losing its grip and becoming less important. Now, I don't know if there's any worldwide study of this, because it's a very interesting question. Where in the world this is fading away and where it's still powerful? And there may be studies of particular places. Where was Sanjeev Goyal talking about? By the way, he's written a very nice review of my book in the Journal of Economic Literature, which you can find.
I think Sanjeev Goyal, as far as I remember, also referred to cases in Southeast Asia, but he didn't specifically talk about endogamy, but he spoke more about informal networks on lines of community and sort of extended family relations and so on, in terms of, say, who recommends you to a particular job, uh, as
Right.
opposed to, say, connections that you make it at college or an internship and then, say, go on to recommend you somewhere.
So
Hmm.
I'm sorry, I lost some of what you're muted. You're muted.
He was talking about informal networks in a broader sense. That's what I was saying.
Right. But of course, informal networks for finding jobs may be different from the ones that result in people going on dates or getting married. So there may be different kinds of networks for different kinds of parts of your life. You know, your labor market situation, your marital situation, your family situation, maybe your political situation may have different networks again. And so that's very interesting. And I don't think we have very few studies where those are all treated together. I think the Adrian Mayer's book is one of those that talks about all those issues. but of course it's now about 75 years old. So I don't think, maybe I'm not up to date. I'm probably not up to date, but I don't know if anyone has done a study like that since that time. And of course, he was writing about small rural villages. Now, I think it's still true that India is about 60% village as opposed to cities. Is that right?
Roughly.
So more or less. So that doesn't seem to change very much. And so a lot of the things that we think of as being traditional Indian patterns in villages are still, the villages are still where most people live. And so that's a very, well, we could spend many days talking about the complexities of India, about which I know just a little bit, and about which, of course, you know much more because you are living the experience of it. But it's quite fascinating.
We'll just take a few questions from the chat box because we have no other question from our side. And then we can end after we've taken a few from the chat box. I think the audience can either raise their hand in case they would like to turn on the camera and the mic and ask it verbally, or they could just send it in the chat box if they aren't in a position to ask the question verbally. So Keshavaditya has raised his hand, so I'll unmute him.
Hello, am I audible and visible? I hope I am. All right. Hello, sir. So my question to you is, economic geographers have emphasized that context matters, which is that similar transformation processes in different places will always have a different outcome because they're going to be determined by multiple factors like regional cultures or local institutions. So do you think that digital platforms and markets will be similarly differentiated by place? For example, the Uber model could probably be embedded differently in cities with strong labor unions or social welfare norms, like someplace in Western Europe, versus a city with a weak institution. So, how do we think about this interplay between global digital markets and the local networks or like institutional embeddedness that you described for us?
So what are the cases that you find so interesting? Did you mention Uber?
You mentioned Uber. Keshavaditya, you can unmute and
Yes. Yes, sir. I did mention Uber. For example, how do we see that differentiation take place with like a more majorly capitalist company like Uber with a specific model is applied in a place in like, for example, Western Europe with very strong labor laws and so on and so forth?
Yes, I was, some years ago, my wife and I were on vacation in Lisbon, Portugal, and the whole country was in the middle of a strike, and you couldn't get a taxi because all the taxis had big signs saying Uber, and there was a circle said Uber, and there was a line through it. So that it was labor agitation. The taxis were all on strike because they wanted Uber to be banned. As you say, they had strong labor laws. And so it was very difficult to get around Lisbon because you couldn't get a taxi because of the strike against Uber. Now, I don't know if that's continued to be the case. I don't know. I have never studied Uber. I know we couldn't take it when we were in Lisbon. That was about 10 years ago, I think. So that's right. There is resistance. I think that what we don't know is whether the people who are the customers, the people who take either taxis or take Uber, we don't know what their attitudes are. We don't know if they are rational economic actors who always want to do the most, the thing that is costs the least money, or whether they also partake of the labor idea, the idea that labor is important and labor laws should be followed. I think that would be a very interesting study. but I don't really know how that works. I had a student actually who studied Uber in Mexico, and that seemed to work very much the way it does in the United States, even though it's rather a different culture. But I think that the question you're asking is a very interesting one, and it's one that we really don't know very much about. So it really needs to be studied much more carefully than it has been. And because it hasn't been studied very much, there's nothing very brilliant that I can say about it. I'm waiting for those studies to be carried out before I can comment very intelligently about them. But it's a very good question. I wish I had a very good answer.
Thank you, sir.
Of course.
Professor, I had a question with regards to Nassim Taleb. You might have read about his theory of anti-fragile. So when he
Theory of what?
Anti-fragile, when he coins the idea of anti-fragile and the black swan theory in his work, he has stated that anti-fragile systems grow stronger under stress. And in that regard, I wanted to ask you is how might we, if we can, reconcile this with your view that over-embedded networks can become brittle, like prone to systematic failures if all the ties enforce the same norms. So what's your take on it?
Okay, I'm sorry. What is Pushkar? Can you explain what the question is?
Sure, sir. Sir, you might have read or you might have heard about Nassim Taleb, another
About what?
Nassim Taleb. You might have heard about him.
Nassim?
Taleb.
Oh, Talem. Is he the financier?
Yeah.
The one who talks about um, highly unusual situations, black swans, and so on? Ah, yes.
Yes. So,
Okay, so now I know who you're talking about. And so are you asking me what I think about the idea of black swans? I'm sorry, you're muted.
so what I wanted to ask is that he argues about anti-fragile systems, that is, systems which grow stronger under stress. However, your view, if we can reconcile both of them together, then it is that over-embedded networks can become brittle and prone to systematic failures if they all enforce the ties in the same norm. So how can we reconcile, if we can, the two concepts?
I don't know the answer to that because I'm not sure that I agree that some networks are inherently fragile in the way that he talks about. I think I would come at it from a rather different perspective. I have a kind of I mean, I understand the idea of black swans, but I don't think I believe that they actually exist. So that makes it harder for me to right. So I'm not sure how the networks work. You have to first believe that before you can start thinking about how the networks might differ. But I'm not sure that that's actually how the world works. But I think that's a longer discussion. And of course, he's not here to talk back. You haven't had him, have you, to talk to this group? No.
Yes.
You're not planning to, it sounds like.
My tenure is almost up, Professor Granovetter. It's up to my successor.
Okay. Well, so I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
There's just, I think, one last question. Could you read it out in the chat box and then we can conclude after that?
Yeah, so Soumya Tyagi asked nearly an hour ago, so what tools or frameworks do you find most helpful when conceptualizing complex ideas like embeddedness? And just to end on an end note, could you pair this along with any other advice you may have for aspiring social scientists or sociologists?
Okay, so which question is this? Is this the one?
By Soumya Tyagi, they dropped.
Yes. What tools or frameworks do I find most helpful when conceptualizing complex ideas like embeddedness?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to think how I would answer that question. I think that to develop an idea like that requires that you know a great deal about what happens in actual economic situations and how whether the things that happen in actual economic situations depend on social relationships or whether they're regulated in other ways, like in hierarchies in organizations or legal frameworks or political frameworks. I think you have to try to figure out how, first of all, how important social relationships and social networks are, and then you have to figure out where they fit among all the other components of society, the political, the economic, the legal, the organizational frameworks. You have to be able to put all those things together. If you're going to say something intelligent about embeddedness, I think that the drawback, the fault in a theorist like Williamson is that he doesn't do that. All he thinks about is people outside of organizations and people in organizations and how hierarchies regulate everything that people can't regulate outside of organizations. That really leaves out so much about what happens in the real world. So I think if you want to talk about embeddedness, you have to know a great deal more than just what networks look like. You have to know what part of the story is accounted for by social networks and how networks relate to legal and political and organizational frameworks. So it's very difficult kind of, it's much easier to do some kind of organizational economics or the kind of thing that Williamson does, new institutional economics. I think it's really very difficult to talk about embeddedness in a reasonable way. And I think one of the things, if you read my 2017 book, you'll see that embeddedness is still in the discussion, but it's part of a much larger discussion that has to do with all those political and legal and economic and organizational frameworks, normative frameworks, cultural frameworks. If you're going to talk about the economy and how it relates to society, then you have to know an awful lot. And it's why it took me so long to finally write that book. I mean, it's almost a little bit embarrassing how long it took me before that book finally came out. But I think talking about embeddedness is very difficult. And you have to know a lot more than if you're just talking about purely legal or organizational frameworks. So it's quite challenging. And I hope that is somewhat of an answer to your question.
I think it's a similarly multidisciplinary approach that we try to promote here in terms of the different discussions or events that we have hosted. And on that note, Professor Granovetter, it was fascinating to talk to you. We nearly lasted 2 hours, I think 1 hour, 45
really?
minutes.
Okay. Oh, you're right.
Time flies, but
yes,
I hope you like
it went by very quickly. You're a very interesting group to talk to, and I do thank you for all your very good questions.